As I often do, I engaged in some procrastination that at least would have some positive accomplishment. So I turned to the magazine contributions collection at the archive, which is where I put every magazine being uploaded, with the idea that it will eventually end up in some sub-collection. And there's a lot of sub-collections at the archive. There's collections for nature magazines, political, fashion, science, writing, and then sub-collections either for titles that we have a lot of copies of or additional miscellaneous collections in these subjects. While doing this, I was particularly focusing on the computer magazines and the video game magazines. Mostly because day to day I deal with entire discords of people trying to track down the most obscure titles and different countries that have various video game and computer documentation. So it's natural that whenever a special issue comes by, perhaps a deep dive into the CPC computer or a magazine that was dedicated to video games out of Uruguay, I want to put them somewhere special for people to find. We're actually suffering from an overflow of these. I don't know how a regular person could find anything that wasn't exactly what they wanted going in. But it did remind me of my early days with computer magazines, and it brings to a real focus exactly how deluded I was in my teenage years. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood, Daniel Boyd, and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. Computer magazines, for me and many others, were an island, a refuge in my teenage years, where I would go down to the local businesses that had magazine racks, go past stalwarts like Life magazine and Time and all sorts of other minor subjects, and then find the computer section. And from the late 1970s until the mid-1980s, there was a flourishing of computer magazines, either general information, programming information, technical overviews, or even almost fan magazines dedicated to different computers. The Tandy, the Amiga, the Atari computers, where you were being told what was coming or what had just been released, along with absolutely delicious screenshots of the graphics that your computer might be capable of. And because I was limited in what I could do in my teenage years, I was also not fully aware of the wide breadth of computer magazines that there were. Only magazines with some amount of distribution in my area could get on my radar, and as I formed my opinion and my knowledge of the history of these, I started to develop a pretty warped idea. Compute Magazine was at the top of the heap, with its extremely easy-to-see logo and the way that it always told you that if you typed in a few things, you could have a word processor or a video game that rivaled commercial products. You'd always pick up a copy of that. And if you were feeling like you really wanted to go for the deep stuff, you picked up Creative Computing, which was so old at that point that it actually predated a lot of microcomputers and represented the idea of computing without really focusing on one particular machine or one particular genre. Then you would have magazines that were nothing but program listings and others that were nothing but promises and empty dreams that you would pick up. And, of course, with a budget, you could only pick up a few titles, read through them when you got them home, and keep flipping over and over through these pages in the weeks to come. building up a stack near your computer, which would have all of your memories of what was going to come or what you had to look out for. In these computer magazines were advertisements, artwork that was nothing like the games you'd be playing. They'd have copy, text that would describe the games in a way that just took your breath away. Broderbund were especially good at this, having an engaging and beautiful cartoon image of a game portrayed in a way that told you this game was going to be unlike anything you were going to ever play before. Sometimes that was true. Often it was not. In the cases where they would include the screenshot, you could immediately see the heat differential between what they were promising and what the games were. And, of course, the reader's service cards at the end that I would circle every number on and just take a flood of mail. It was like subscribing to a different kind of magazine, one that came in different envelopes addressed to me, which provided me with even more in-depth dreams. Because, of course, they didn't know they were mailing some teenager. They thought that they were talking to a business or a business person or maybe some sort of scientist about their products, not knowing that a young kid was opening up and looking through their documents like they were plans for a heist, every single word and every single description burning themselves into my feelings for aesthetics and joy and escape from a teenage world I didn't want to be part of. This endless waterfall of text, imagery, and bound articles represented the bricks from which I built my relationship to computers. I thought at the time that my fingers were in every pie, that I had a universal knowledge of what computers were doing, what was going on, everything you would ever want to know about the subject of computers. It's only been decades later that I've gone through what are now the answers, the digitized issues of all of the different magazines, computer newsletters, user group magazines that tell me what was going on worldwide with these machines. That the electronics world that had come before it, which I didn't know much about, the ham radio world, the world of tinkering with televisions and radio equipment, turning into the same aesthetics and the same outlook in computer magazines. They were a continuum. What had sold perfectly in the 50s and 60s was now being repackaged with new technology in the 70s and the 80s, presented in a whole range of language and logic that had been well crafted, that now told the same old stories in new ways. Advances in printing, allowing full color, or being able to have certain kinds of page types was a reflection of progress. Ironically, computer desktop publishing helping along the way. There were definitely new pieces to this puzzle of what technology was going to do within the realm of society. But there were no universal ways to keep people abreast of all of the different advancements or what was important in one area that might not make it to others. We had bulletin board systems, of course, and Usenet did exist to some extent, but not in the sort of overview of what was commercially available and what businesses were providing. It was a non-commercial entity for many years. So you had to rely on your magazine rack. A few times I did visit New York City and see magazine racks there, and that's where I would have that urge to collect everything, to buy one of every magazine. But the costs were really, truly prohibitive. At anywhere between $1 to $3 an issue, you were facing down a life-destroying amount of money for the purposes of trying to gather history that was slipping through your fingers by the month. Finding out that there were these catalogs, these reader guides to periodic literature that allowed you to know which stories were there and which libraries might have old magazines, it provided some refuge, some hope that it might not all be lost. Here, then, in my current life, I am lucky and I have won the contest. I work for an entity that has collected hundreds of thousands of issues of magazines, magazines going back centuries, magazines going in every niche direction, magazines that have been OCR'd so that you can look at the text and search for it, maybe finding out about a title that was covering something of importance to you, and then reading as many back issues as you could. These were meant to be disposable magazines, with very little exception. Very few of them were thought of to be volumes in some sort of assembled large-scale work. There were a few. There were certainly journals that would provide themselves with volume numbers going across years, the idea being that each paper being published in them was to become a citation and a reference going forward. But most pop magazines were not sharing that outlook. These ethereal sets of words and pictures, well, their destiny was oblivion. How lucky are we that so many have been scanned and survive online? What sort of utopia do we live in that these pieces of our own memories can be drawn up again to variant quality, but certainly providing touchstones and lighthouses of knowing what made us what we are? The person I am now came from being the person back then. And while I thought the world expanded beyond all measure in my early years, I now know I had a flashlight in the darkness. It feels very, very good to switch to a searchlight. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Martin, Symbionts, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere, who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. You must have visited our magazine rack, archive.org/details/magazine_rack. It has nearly 500,000 issues floating within it, and people are uploading anywhere between a few dozen and a few hundred issues every day. It's a miracle that these items, long thought to be lost, are finding a new home. It's one of the greatest things I've been a part of, and I draw so much of myself from the joy of sifting through all of these treasures.